The night began like any other in Virginia Beach in the summer of 1983. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and honeysuckle, the hum of cicadas rising from the trees, and the rhythmic crash of distant waves somewhere beyond the neat rows of houses. It was the kind of night when children played kickball in the street long after dinner, and porch lights flickered on one by one as parents called their kids home. For 13-year-old Patricia Bolton, it was supposed to be just another evening spent laughing with her best friend before school started up again. She had begged her mother, Eleanor, to let her ride her bike over to Jessica's house, just 3 blocks away. Eleanor had agreed, but with one condition: be home before dark. Patricia had nodded, brushing her sun-bleached hair from her face and flashing the smile that melted her mother's heart. When the clock struck 7:30, Patricia climbed onto her red bicycle, the same one her father had given her for her birthday 2 months earlier. She pedaled down the quiet street, the tires crunching over gravel, her yellow dress fluttering in the warm breeze. Neighbors who saw her waved, and she waved back. Nothing seemed out of place. It was the kind of neighborhood where people trusted one another, where kids left their bikes on lawns and doors stayed unlocked. By 8:15, the last traces of daylight had faded into violet shadows. Patricia's mother stood by the window, watching for the familiar glint of her daughter's bike reflectors. The street was still, save for the hum of insects and the occasional bark of a dog. Eleanor checked the time again. 8:30. Then 8:45. Worry began to creep in, subtle at first, then heavier with each passing minute. She called Jessica's mother, who answered in a calm, confused tone. Patricia had left over an hour ago. They'd watched her right away, turning right onto Bayberry Lane, heading home. By 9, Eleanor's unease hardened into fear. She stepped out onto the porch, the screen door creaking behind her, and called out into the night. Patty, are you out there?" Her voice echoed down the street unanswered. She walked halfway down the block, glancing at every shadowed corner, every flickering street lamp, but there was no sign of the red bicycle, no sound of wheels on pavement. The stillness felt wrong, too thick, too quiet. She went back inside, picked up the phone with trembling hands, and dialed the police. Within half an hour, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside the Bolton home. Their flashing lights cast a red and blue glow across the small front yard. Officer Daniels, a young man who had grown up in the area, knocked gently on the door. He listened as Eleanor explained through tears that her daughter had gone out around 7:30 and never returned. He asked a few questions: what she was wearing, what route she might have taken, if there was anyone who might want to harm her. Eleanor shook her head helplessly. Patricia was a good girl, polite, friendly, never any trouble. A quick search of the immediate area began. Flashlights sliced through the darkness as officers and neighbors fanned out through the nearby streets. They checked the park, the schoolyard, the vacant lot where kids like to play baseball. Nothing. Then, just after 10, one of the officers radioed in. They'd found something near the corner of Bayberry and Shore Drive. Patricia's red bicycle, lying on its side in a drainage ditch, its handlebars twisted, the front wheel slowly spinning as if someone had just let go of it. Eleanor arrived at the scene moments later, running barefoot down the street. She recognized the bike instantly, her hand flying to her mouth. The officer held her back, urging her not to touch anything. The area was cordoned off, flashlights darting across the pavement searching for clues. There were no skid marks, no footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle. It looked eerily staged, as though the bike had been placed there deliberately. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, whispering in anxious tones. Someone said they'd seen a dark truck parked near the intersection earlier that evening. Maybe blue or green, maybe an old Ford. Another said they'd heard a car door slam around the same time Patricia should have been passing by. But no one had seen her get into a car. No one had heard a scream. It was as if the night itself had swallowed her whole. By midnight, the search had expanded. Dozens of volunteers joined in, combing the nearby woods, fields, and backyards. Flashlights flickered through the darkness like fireflies. Voices called her name again and again. Dogs were brought in, sniffing along the ditches and fences, their handlers whispering commands. For a while they seemed to catch a scent, but it disappeared near the edge of the marshland, where the smell of salt water overtook everything else. Back at the Bolton home, Eleanor sat on the couch, clutching Patricia's favorite stuffed rabbit, her face pale and hollow. Her husband, Richard, had returned from his night shift at the shipyard and was now pacing the living room, his fists clenched. Reporters had already begun calling, word spreading through the quiet town faster than anyone could contain it. "Local girl missing," one headline would read the next morning. 13-year-old disappears without a trace. As dawn broke over Virginia Beach, the search continued. Police helicopters swept over the coastline, scanning the sand dunes and wooded trails. The community center became a hub of activity, filled with maps, photographs, and coffee cups. Strangers showed up offering to help, mothers weeping as they handed out flyers with Patricia's photo on them. A smiling girl with freckles, wearing a yellow dress. The town had been shaken awake, and an invisible fear crept into every household. Detective Alan Brooks arrived that morning, assigned to lead the investigation. He had seen tragedies before, drownings, runaways, domestic disputes, but this felt different. There was something chillingly precise about it. The missing bicycle, the silence, the absence of struggle. He crouched by the ditch, studying the ground where the bike had been found. The dirt was undisturbed. The grass bent only slightly, as though someone had placed it there carefully. He noted the time, the angle of the streetlight, the position of the bike. He knew instinctively that whoever took Patricia had planned this. Meanwhile, Eleanor refused to sleep. She sat by the phone, praying it would ring with good news. Every sound outside made her jump. A car engine, a knock at the door, the distant wail of a siren. Each one filled her with a desperate, fleeting hope that her daughter had been found. But the calls that came were only from officers asking for more details, confirming search routes, checking family, friends, and relatives. Every lead seemed to end in nothing. That night, as the search dragged into its second day, the community gathered for a candlelight vigil at the park. Hundreds stood in a circle, candles flickering in the humid air, faces bowed in silence. Eleanor stood at the front, her husband beside her, his arm around her trembling shoulders. She whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice breaking as she said Patricia's name. The candles reflected in her tear-streaked eyes, and for a moment the crowd held its breath, and as if together, through sheer will, they could pull the girl back from wherever she'd gone. But the night stayed silent. The ocean winds carried only the sound of waves and the faint sobs of a mother who refused to give up. And somewhere beyond the reach of the flashlights and search dogs, someone knew exactly what had happened to Patricia Bolton. Someone who had watched her ride that bike into the fading light and made sure she never came home again. Detective Alan Brooks arrived at the station the next morning with a cup of coffee in his hand and dark circles under his eyes. He had barely slept. The Bolton case had already spread through Virginia Beach like wildfire, and the pressure to find the missing girl was crushing. Reporters waited outside the precinct, their cameras ready, asking for statements the department didn't have answers for. Inside, the bulletin board in the investigation room was already covered with photos, maps, and scribbled notes connected by red string. Patricia's school photo was pinned at the center. Her young, hopeful eyes seemed to follow everyone in the room, a reminder of what was at stake. Brooks studied the board for a long time before speaking. She didn't just disappear. Somebody took her, and they knew what they were doing. His team had already started canvassing the neighborhood. Dozens of people were questioned that morning. Joggers, delivery drivers, teenagers who claimed they'd seen something near the drainage ditch. One witness, an elderly man who lived a block from the Boltons, swore he saw a blue pickup truck parked by the corner just before dark. He couldn't remember the license plate, but he described the driver as a middle-aged white man with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap. Another witness, a teenage girl walking home from work, said she saw a man talking to a young girl near a phone booth on Shore Drive that same evening. The girl was wearing a yellow dress. It wasn't much, but it was something. The department pulled every record they could find on local residents with blue trucks. They came up with 32 names. Brooks and his partner, Detective Ray Lopez, split the list and started knocking on doors. Most of the people were cooperative, some even frightened to be questioned in connection with the case. But one name caught Brooks's attention early: Carl Jennings, a handyman who lived on the outskirts of town. He had an old blue Ford pickup and a criminal record for trespassing, petty theft, and one unsettling incident of indecent exposure near a local playground back in 1979. Jennings wasn't convicted, but the incident was enough to make Brooks suspicious. When they visited Jennings's small trailer home, the man answered the door shirtless, his belly hanging over his jeans, his eyes bloodshot. He looked irritated rather than nervous. Brooks introduced himself and explained they were following up on a missing child report. Jennings smirked slightly and said he'd heard about it on the radio. "Terrible thing," he muttered. "Kids these days, you never know where they run off to." Brooks asked him if he'd been near Shore Drive the night Patricia disappeared. Jennings shook his head quickly. "Nah, I was home watching TV. Got nobody to run around with these days." Lopez glanced around the property, an old swing set rusting in the backyard, empty beer bottles scattered by the porch. Nothing overtly suspicious, but something about the man's detached tone lingered in Brooks's mind. He noted it in his report and moved on. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Flyers covered telephone poles, grocery stores, and church bulletin boards. The Boltons appeared on local television, pleading for their daughter's return. Eleanor Bolton's voice cracked as she held Patricia's photograph for the cameras, her words trembling but clear. "If anyone has her, please let her come home. She's just a child." The entire town was watching, hearts breaking with every replay of her tearful plea. The police received dozens of calls after that broadcast. Some claimed to have seen Patricia in nearby cities. Others claimed to know who took her. Most were false leads. By the seventh day, morale in the department had begun to wane. Brooks sat in his office late one evening, staring at the case file spread across his desk. The details swirled in his head: the timeline, the witnesses, the abandoned bicycle. He could almost feel Patricia's presence in the quiet moments, as if she were urging him to look closer to see what he had missed. He opened a map and traced her route from Jessica's house to home. The spot where the bike was found didn't make sense. It was off the direct route, a detour. Why would she go that way unless someone called her over or forced her off the path? Then late that night, a call came in. A fisherman had found something near Back Bay. A torn piece of floral fabric tangled in the reeds. Brooks was on the scene within an hour, standing by the water with his flashlight. The marsh stretched out before him, the air thick with mosquitoes and the distant croak of frogs. The fabric was retrieved carefully and bagged. Under the harsh beam of the flashlight, he could see it clearly. Faded pink flowers on white cotton. Eleanor confirmed it belonged to Patricia. She had sewn that very dress herself. The discovery reignited the investigation with grim intensity. Search teams were dispatched to the marshlands, combing through knee-deep water and thick brush. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting through the dawn mist. Officers moved in silence, knowing what they might find. And then around midday, one of them shouted. The area fell silent except for the wind moving through the grass. Brooks followed the sound, pushing through the reeds until he saw her. Patricia's small body lay half buried in mud, her hair matted, her skin pale against the dark earth. A sob caught in his throat, one he quickly swallowed. Even after years on the job, this part never got easier. The medical examiner arrived soon after. Preliminary signs pointed to strangulation. There were faint bruises on her wrists and defensive marks on her hands. The coroner's quiet voice carried across the scene as he spoke to Brooks. She fought back. The words hit hard. Brooks closed his eyes, letting the reality sink in. This wasn't a random act. It was deliberate, cruel, and deeply personal. As the crime scene was processed, a small but significant clue emerged. Near the body, partially embedded in the mud, was a faint tire tread. The pattern was distinctive, worn but unique enough to trace. Forensic technicians cast it carefully, and later analysis revealed it matched the tires of older Ford pickup trucks. Brooks's thoughts immediately turned to Carl Jennings. He ordered a warrant to search Jennings's vehicle and property. When officers arrived at Jennings's trailer, he looked irritated again, as if the intrusion was an inconvenience rather than an accusation. His blue Ford sat in the driveway, muddy around the wheel wells. The search turned up several items of interest. A piece of rope behind the seat, a small scrap of fabric stuck under the passenger side door, and a set of tire chains that looked rarely used. Jennings claimed the rope was for work. The fabric must have come from an old seat cover, and the mud was from a recent fishing trip. But the forensic team found fibers on the passenger seat that were microscopically consistent with the material from Patricia's dress. Jennings was brought in for questioning. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting on the table. Brooks watched him closely. "Carl," he began, his tone calm but firm, "we found fibers from Patricia's dress in your truck. You want to explain that?" Jennings' jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I don't know any Patricia." Brooks leaned forward, voice low. "You were seen near Shore Drive that night. You drive the same kind of truck that left tire marks near her body. Help me understand why that's not a coincidence." Jennings's face flushed red, and for a moment his composure cracked. "People see things all the time," he muttered. "Doesn't mean it's me." Hours passed. The detectives took turns pressing him, alternating between empathy and pressure. Jennings maintained his innocence, but his story began to shift in small ways. The time he claimed to have been home, what show he said he'd watched on TV, even the shirt he'd been wearing. Every inconsistency made Brooks more certain he had the right man. But certainty wasn't evidence, and without a confession or solid DNA, the case would rest on circumstantial proof. That night, Brooks returned home long after midnight. He poured himself a drink and sat in silence, staring at the folder on his kitchen table. Patricia's photo stared back, her smile frozen in time. The weight of failure pressed on his chest. Somewhere out there, the truth was waiting, buried beneath lies, fear, and silence. He knew this was only the beginning, and that justice for Patricia Bolton would not come easily. The morning Patricia's body was found, the world seemed to fall still over Virginia Beach. The news spread faster than the wind that rolled off the Atlantic. By the time the sun rose, a quiet grief had settled over the town, heavy and suffocating. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors stood on their lawns whispering, and the yellow ribbons tied around trees now fluttered like faint reminders of a hope that had died overnight. Detective Alan Brooks stood at the edge of the marsh, his boots sinking into the damp soil, staring down at the small body covered now by a sheet. He had been in this line of work long enough to know the look of finality, but it never stopped feeling like a punch to the gut. Patricia had been missing for 10 days. 10 days of unanswered prayers, sleepless nights, and desperate searching. And now there she was, found in the place everyone had dreaded they would find her. The crime scene buzzed with quiet efficiency. Forensics teams combed the area, collecting soil samples, footprints, and tire impressions. The marsh was a difficult place to work, thick with mud, the smell of decay, and the sound of insects that seemed louder in the silence. Brooks crouched beside the cast of the tire tread they'd discovered. He studied it carefully, committing every groove and line to memory. It was consistent with the pattern of an older Ford truck, a detail that tightened the circle around Carl Jennings. But even so, Brooks felt a strange unease, the kind that came from knowing a piece of the puzzle was still missing. Patricia's parents were notified later that afternoon. When Brooks arrived at the Bolton home, he stood on the porch for a moment, gathering himself before knocking. Eleanor opened the door, her face pale, her eyes red from days of crying. She didn't need him to speak. She already knew. The moment their eyes met, her knees buckled, and she let out a sound that Brooks would never forget. A low, broken wail that seemed to carry every ounce of sorrow in the world. Richard Bolton caught his wife as she collapsed, his own tears silent but unending. Brooks wanted to tell them he'd find the man who did this, that he would make sure justice was done, but the words felt hollow in the face of such grief. The autopsy results came back 2 days later. Cause of death, strangulation. There were no signs of sexual assault, but there were bruises on her wrists and under her arms, consistent with being forcibly restrained. Dirt under her fingernails suggested she had fought hard. The medical examiner also found traces of a particular type of mud containing fine grains of sand and shell fragments, a mixture common near Back Bay but not found elsewhere inland. That detail placed the killer squarely in that area the night she was killed. Brooks leaned over the report, his pen tapping against the table. The fibers from Jennings's truck, the tire marks, the proximity of his home to the marsh, it all pointed one way. Still, he wanted the case to be airtight. He had seen too many convictions fall apart over a single doubt. The arrest came quickly. Officers surrounded Jennings's trailer at dawn. He was dragged from his bed, shouting and cursing as he was handcuffed. "I didn't touch that girl," he yelled as they pushed him into the back of the cruiser. The neighbors watched from their windows, some relieved, others stunned. For the first time in weeks, the town seemed to exhale. Brooks watched as the car drove away, feeling a surge of satisfaction tempered by the dull ache of uncertainty. He had his suspect, but something inside him whispered that the case wasn't as clean as it appeared. During the interrogation, Jennings's bravado flickered. He sat slouched in the metal chair, his arms crossed, eyes darting around the room. Brooks laid out the evidence on the table one piece at a time. Photographs of the tire prints, the fibers from his truck, the timeline of his movements. Jennings stayed silent for a while, then smirked. "You got no proof I killed anyone," he muttered. "You're trying to make me into your monster because you can't find the real one." Brooks leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "The fibers match. The tires match. You were in the area. That's 3 chances you had to be somewhere else, but you weren't. Tell me why, Carl." Jennings stared at him, unblinking. "I didn't kill her," he said again, quieter this time, as if trying to convince himself. Despite his denial, the case against him built steadily. A witness came forward claiming to have seen Jennings' blue truck parked near the marsh the night Patricia disappeared. Another neighbor said he'd seen him burning something in a metal drum behind his trailer 2 days after she went missing. When investigators sifted through the ashes, they found melted plastic and charred fabric remnants. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough for the prosecution to argue intent. The town wanted closure, and Jennings became the embodiment of their collective fear. The trial began in early 1984, and every seat in the courtroom was filled. Reporters crowded the steps outside, broadcasting every development to an audience hungry for justice. Eleanor Bolton sat in the front row, clutching Patricia's photograph, her expression fixed and distant. When Jennings entered the courtroom, she didn't look away. The prosecution's case was methodical, laying out the evidence with clinical precision. The defense argued there was no direct physical link, no DNA, no eyewitness to the abduction. But in those days, before forensic science had advanced as it has now, circumstantial evidence often carried enough weight. Brooks testified on the third day, recounting the investigation in detail. He spoke calmly, professionally, but inside he felt a knot forming in his stomach. The fibers, the truck, the tire tread, it all added up. Yet something about Jennings's demeanor nagged at him. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't remorseful either, but he didn't have the jittery defensiveness Brooks had seen in other killers. It was as though Jennings knew the evidence was strong enough to convict him, whether he was guilty or not. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom waited in suffocating silence. 3 days later, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Jennings showed no reaction as the sentence was handed down. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Eleanor Bolton wept quietly in her husband's arms, and Brooks stood near the back, watching as Jennings was led away in chains. The crowd outside erupted into applause when the news broke. Virginia Beach finally had its justice and the case was closed. But Brooks couldn't rest easy. Late that night, he sat alone in his office, staring at Patricia's case file. Something in his gut told him they'd missed something crucial. He reopened the photos from the crime scene, zooming in on details others might overlook. The angle of the tire tracks, the impressions around her body, the spacing between the footprints. One detail struck him. There were 2 distinct sets of footprints in the mud, one larger, one smaller, and they overlapped inconsistently. It suggested a struggle, but it also suggested there could have been someone else there besides Jennings. Brooks requested additional lab work, but with the case already closed and public satisfaction high, his request was quietly dismissed by his superiors. He was told to move on, to focus on the next case. Jennings was behind bars and the department's reputation had been restored. Still, Brooks couldn't let it go. He visited Jennings in prison 6 months later, bringing a copy of the evidence list. Jennings looked older already, thinner, his eyes dull. "Why are you here?" he asked flatly. Brooks studied him for a long moment before replying. "Because I'm not sure we got it right." Jennings smirked faintly. "Maybe you didn't," he said, and turned away. Years later, after DNA testing became more sophisticated, new results emerged. The fibers found in Jennings's truck didn't belong to Patricia after all. They were from a cheap blanket that had been stored under his seat. The mud samples didn't match perfectly either. The realization hit Brooks like a wave. They had convicted the wrong man. But by then, Jennings was serving his 3rd decade in prison, and the true killer had vanished into the folds of time. Even now, when the wind howls through the marshes, near Back Bay, locals say you can hear faint whispers. Patricia's name carried softly through the reeds. Detective Brooks, long retired, still drives out there sometimes. He stands at the edge of the water, the memory of that small red bicycle forever etched in his mind, and wonders if the man who took her still walks free, living quietly somewhere by the same sea that swallowed her last breath. The trial of Carl Jennings had ended, but for Detective Alan Brooks it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like a door half closed, a story with missing pages. The courtroom had erupted in relief when the verdict was read, and the town of Virginia Beach seemed to breathe again for the first time in months. Patricia Bolton's name was spoken with reverence, her smiling face appearing on the front page of every local paper. People left flowers near the marsh where she'd been found. and for a while the Boltons received letters and prayers from strangers who promised they would never forget her. The case was considered solved, justice delivered. Yet in the quiet corners of Brooks's mind, unease lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. He replayed every moment of the investigation in his head over and over. The tire tracks, the fibers, the statements. On paper, it all pointed to Jennings. The jury had seen a man with a record, a man who lived alone and had no alibi. They had seen an easy villain, and maybe that was what they needed. Someone to hate, someone to hold responsible for what had been done to that little girl. But Brooks had been doing this too long to trust appearances. Evil, he knew, didn't always look like the man people expected. Sometimes it wore a smile, blended in, and disappeared into ordinary life. Months passed after the sentencing. The Boltons moved away from the neighborhood, unable to live with the memories that haunted every corner of their home. Patricia's room was left untouched until the day they packed up. Her favorite book still stacked by her bed, the stuffed rabbit still resting on her pillow. The local news eventually stopped talking about her. New stories came, new tragedies took over the headlines, and the town moved on. But Brooks couldn't. He kept the case file locked in his desk drawer, reopening it late at night when the precinct was quiet. Each time he did, he found himself staring at the same small details that didn't fit neatly into the narrative they'd built around Jennings. There were 2 sets of footprints at the crime scene. That had always bothered him. The larger set matched Jennings's boot size, but the smaller set was never conclusively identified. The pattern was faint, partially washed away by the tide, but it was there. He remembered asking the forensic team about it. They'd brushed it off, saying it could have been one of the searchers or an animal print distorted by the mud. Still, Brooks wasn't convinced. He also remembered a report about a suspicious vehicle seen not just near the marsh, but hours earlier, near the same phone booth where Patricia was last seen. The witness had described it not as a blue pickup, but a dark sedan. That detail had been lost amid the noise once the case turned toward Jennings. Brooks pulled up that report again, tracing the lines of faded ink with his finger. There it was. A small inconsistency buried beneath stacks of evidence that had seemed so certain at the time. He decided to visit Jennings in prison. It had been almost a year since the conviction. The warden met him in the visiting area, where the air smelled faintly of bleach and metal. Jennings sat across from him, thinner than before, his hair starting to gray. He smirked when he saw Brooks. "Didn't expect to see you again, Detective," he said, his voice tired but still sharp. Brooks leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I came because I'm not sure we got it right," he admitted quietly. Jennings raised an eyebrow. "Now you figure that out?" he said with a bitter laugh. "You ruined my life." Brooks didn't respond. He studied Jennings's eyes, searching for guilt, fear, anything that might betray him. But what he saw there was something else. Emptiness, maybe resignation, but not deception. "Tell me where you were that night," Brooks pressed. Jennings shook his head slowly. "I told you already, home alone. I don't have anyone to vouch for me, so that makes me guilty, huh?" Brooks left the prison more conflicted than when he'd arrived. If Jennings was lying, he was doing it masterfully. But if he was telling the truth, then the real killer was still out there. The thought chilled him more than he wanted to admit. He filed a formal request to have some of the old evidence retested using newer technology, particularly the fibers and mud samples. The request took months to process, but when the results came in, they changed everything. The fibers found in Jennings's truck weren't from Patricia's dress at all. They were synthetic, the kind used in cheap blankets, not cotton clothing. The mud samples, too, didn't match perfectly with the soil at Back Bay. They were similar, but not identical. It wasn't enough to overturn the conviction, at least not immediately. But it was enough to confirm Brooks's growing suspicion. They had built their case on circumstantial details that only looked like proof. Brooks brought the findings to the district attorney, who listened patiently but ultimately refused to reopen the case. "Alan, we have a conviction. A clean one. Don't tear open old wounds," the DA said, his tone weary but final. "That family deserves peace." Brooks wanted to argue, to shout that peace built on a lie wasn't peace at all, but he held his tongue. He left the office feeling defeated, the walls of bureaucracy closing in around him. Jennings stayed behind bars, and the Boltons, who had already endured unimaginable pain, never knew the truth might be different from what they'd been told. Years slipped by. Brooks grew older, his hair turning silver, his hands less steady. He retired quietly, taking with him the weight of cases that still haunted him in the small hours of the night. Patricia's was the heaviest. He kept her photograph in his wallet, the same one from the missing posters. Her freckles, her shy smile, her bright eyes. Sometimes he would drive out to the marsh where her body had been found. The area was overgrown now, the water still and dark, the cattails swaying in the wind. He would stand there for hours, remembering the searchlights cutting through the fog, the soft hum of police radios, and the terrible stillness when they'd realized what they had found. In the early 2000s, long after Brooks had retired, a cold case unit reopened the file using DNA technology that hadn't existed 2 decades earlier. The team contacted him to consult, and for the first time in years, Brooks felt a flicker of hope. The evidence from Patricia's dress had been preserved carefully enough for testing. When the results came back, they shocked everyone. The DNA found under Patricia's fingernails did not belong to Carl Jennings. It belonged to an unknown male. Further investigation linked the same DNA to a series of unsolved assaults across Virginia in the late 1980s, long after Jennings had been imprisoned. The killer had been out there the whole time, committing more crimes while the wrong man rotted behind bars. The discovery made the local news again, reigniting old wounds. Jennings's lawyers filed for a retrial, and after nearly 25 years in prison, he was finally exonerated. The state issued an apology, though it did little to restore what had been stolen from him. Brooks watched the news coverage alone in his living room, his heart heavy. The real killer was never identified. The DNA profile was added to national databases, but no match ever surfaced. The trail had gone cold once again. Brooks drove to the beach that night. The ocean stretched out endlessly before him, dark and endless under the moonlight. He thought about Patricia, the little girl who should have grown up, gone to college, fallen in love, lived a long life. He thought about Jennings, the man who had lost half his life to someone else's crime. And he thought about himself, an old detective who had followed every lead but still failed to bring the truth fully into the light. The sea breeze was cool against his face, and for a moment, he could almost hear her name in the wind. Soft, faint, carried through the sound of the waves. Virginia Beach never forgot her. Some nights when the fog rolled in thick and the air hung heavy with the smell of salt, people said they could still hear the distant echo of a bicycle bell, faint but unmistakable, followed by the whisper of a girl's laughter carried out to sea. And somewhere, maybe still walking among them, was the man who had taken her life, living quietly with his secret. Detective Brooks knew he might never find him. But he also knew one thing for certain. Justice, real justice, doesn't fade with time. It lingers, waiting just like the memory of a little girl who never made it home.